Tonight, Starmer tells his cabinet the rules of government are being rewritten. We're going for growth. But it's going to take at least a year to get going and lead to a big fight. We've got a special report from our deputy political editor, Sam Coates. Also tonight, new figures show net migration is set to rise by nearly 5 million by 2032. Downing Street's describing the number as staggeringly high. We'll take a closer look. Also tonight, the race to become an AI superpower is hotting up as China's DeepSeek makes a big breakthrough. So where does that leave the UK? I'll speak to the former Defence Secretary, Shapps. And as the youngest ever White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, makes her first appearance tonight, we'll look at how she's got on. Appearing with us tonight, Tom Baldwin and Joe Tanner, who'll be with us for the next hour. It's Tuesday, I'm Sophy Ridge, live from Westminster, and this is the Politics Hub. Hello, good evening. Would you like £100? I think I probably know the answer to that. But would you like £100 if it meant you had to, I don't know, live in a shed for 5 years on your own, eating nothing but kale? Now, I know this sounds like a very flippant way to open the programme, but bear with me because I'm trying to make a serious point about growth, because this is basically the problem that Rachel Reeves has got. The Chancellor says she wants to prioritise growth, and everyone goes, great, I like growth too. Growth is good, I'm on board, great plan. But of course, if you prioritise something, that means you've got to deprioritise other things. And that means difficult decisions on the environment, on regulations that help keep us safe and mitigate against risk, on what you decide to spend your money on and what you don't. And tomorrow really is the beginning of the difficult decisions, kicking off with the third runway at Heathrow Airport. In theory, everyone loves growth, but the reality could be a lot more bumpy. Here's Sky's deputy political editor, Sam Coates, with tonight's first report.
These lush fields are the front line of the nation's new political battleground. The government wants far more of this, building on the Greenbelt. And with the population set to rise by 5 million in the next 10 years, the need has rarely been more urgent. But all over the country, local campaigners are already digging in.
That really is unacceptable.
It's undemocratic, it's aggressive and a disaster.
Please fight to stop this.
It should not be built on the Greenbelt.
It's a nationwide chorus of opposition.
I think we need the Greenbelt.
Silencing all these voices won't be easy. A local campaign here in Marks Tay in Essex has fought against development for 5 years. On Wednesday, Chancellor Rachel Reeves will reveal her plan to remove the hurdles to building in places like this.
It's a war on nature, it's a war on communities, and it's not actually solving the problems that need to be solved. People aren't going to shut up and let this happen, so I think there's going to be a huge amount of pressure on the government going forward.
This shows the scale of that pressure. Over 700 local campaigns against building projects dotted all over the country. From opposing a solar plant in Lincolnshire to new roads in Shropshire. The majority are targeting proposals for new homes, including many in the capital, and major redevelopments in one of the country's most built-up areas. The fight against this project on London's South Bank went all the way to the High Court, delayed it by 3 years and added millions to the cost. And that is exactly what this government is trying to avoid, which is why it's proposing 3 big changes. That means 3 big fights. Changing the laws that protect our environment, overhauling the rules that mean that developers have to consult far and wide, and limiting the ability of communities to object in the courts. Each change brings an army of opponents, but without that, will this government ever bring growth? The Prime Minister today again staking his reputation on that goal.
Let me reiterate, growth is the #1 mission of this government, wealth creation.
And not shying away from the trade-offs.
Of course, we also have climate commitments, but growth is really important to our agenda. That's why I've had this engagement this morning. That's why I've got a big speech coming up from the Chancellor.
There are allies who say that growth can still be green.
This does not mean watering down protections for nature. Under the current regime, we are failing to protect British species. Successive governments have grappled with this problem over decades and failed to deliver the reform that we need. Why? Because NIMBYism is one of the strongest political forces in the country.
This government wants its legacy to be buildings and roads on these fields. They say opponents are slowing down the nation's progress. The battle for growth is just getting started. Sam Coates, Sky News, Essex.
Well, Sam's back here with us now. The battle for growth. I mean, she set out her ambitions, but I guess the delivery, as always, is going to be key.
That's right. I've been talking to business groups, I've been talking to Labour MPs. Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer get an A for effort. There's no doubt that actually the package that I was talking about in that film, overhauling some of the nature regulations, looking again about the way that the courts and judicial review and consultations can be used, looking at all of that in the round is a good thing, and a lot of people support it. But as you say, Sophie, the question is, we're only at the stage where ministers are announcing something. Can they put that down in a form, into legal text, get it into a bill? Can they get it through both houses of Parliament, come out the other side and use these new laws to make growth actually happen? And that is an altogether different question. As you said at the top of the programme, that's going to take a year. And really, I suspect that campaigns against this haven't really got going. There's some grumbling amongst nature and environment groups. There's clearly opposition amongst local planning groups. But the question is, where are Labour MPs? At the moment, they're broadly supportive. But the question is, does that hold? And that depends a bit on the public. Now, we've been doing some pollings, exclusive polling for Sky News, and actually you get some quite contradictory views when you ask the public. Now, I want you to look at this first slide. Now, the first one is a poll that we got YouGov to do. We asked, do you think Britain's planning system is too easy or too hard to build things? Only 16% said it was too easy, 38% said it was too hard.
Right, so people want building, right?
Yeah.
If you look at that.
Yeah, now watch this. Look at the next slide. And the question that YouGov asked then was, would you prioritise building over the environment or the other way around? And now look at this, there's a clear winner here. If it's a question of watering down environmental protections, then people would rather you didn't do that and didn't have building than did both. Now, that's the kind of dilemma that this government is facing. And previous governments have faced, previous Tory governments faced full-on campaigns from all of the NGOs and the charities and the Green Group saying, don't do something. Many of those feel that they're part of the Labour Party. I think that could feel really difficult if they all decide to get going at this overhaul, particularly of the nature and environment rules.
It really gives you a sense, doesn't it, just looking at that polling, how bumpy things could get. I mean, it seems to me like the Chancellor's going to need a few people on side.
Yeah, we have to start by reminding ourselves there's a 161 majority for Keir Starmer. So he's got a good chance of getting stuff through, but it could get quite sticky, as you say. So he needs allies. And today, I found a rather unusual one, a prominent Conservative mayor. Ben Hutch and Rachel Reeves is giving a major speech tomorrow about growth. What should she say? What are you expecting her to say? Have you heard anything that she will say?
Well, what's been trailed seems pretty laudable, right? They want to go for growth, they want to create jobs, bring investment, they want to take the brakes off. So all of that at a pretty high level, I don't think many people can particularly disagree with, particularly where this country's been in recent months, and if we're honest, recent years. But that's got to be contrasted, and what I'm interested about in the speech is what is the way in which they're going to deliver that. So the rhetoric's one thing, but what's the detail about how they're actually going to take the brakes off? Is it going to be effective? Is it going to be timely? And are they going to make the difference in the timescales that they say they're going to make them in?
Is there anything that Rachel Reeves can do for the people of Tees Valley right now, the people that you represent? Are there any announcements that you're hoping for tomorrow?
Well, obviously, people in my patch would say they want to lower taxes. You know, things like the NI increase have been hugely devastating to local businesses. There's things like the business property relief, which is a huge problem, not just for farmers, but for family businesses. A family tax is a huge problem that's causing issues right across the country. But really, there's a sense of negativity. There's a sense that this government have kind of set out on trying to really talk down the country in the first few months, I think, to try and frame the political debate. And that's had a real impact, and that's causing consternation. And what we need to do is have a bit of a lift, and we need a clear strategy and a direction of travel. So people can say, actually, yes, we agree with the top line, but we also can see the direction of travel that this is really deliverable and is going to happen over the coming months and years ahead.
I mean, that's quite a lot of negativity about tomorrow's speech by Rachel Reeves, perhaps unsurprising given you're a political opponent, but isn't the truth that the kinds of things she's going to talk about tomorrow are kinds of things that you would welcome wholeheartedly? It seems like the Chancellor's going to look again at the way that we do judicial review and whether or not that's blocking growth, whether or not consultations are too onerous for developers, whether or not the nature and habitat rules need to be looked at again in order to get things going. You are a champion of getting things done in an area. Rachel Reeves is on the right track, isn't she?
And that's the point. The rhetoric that she's talking about, actually, I completely agree with. All of the things that she's trying to do, I agree with. What I want to see tomorrow is how she's going to do that. So if it is true that she's going to tackle some of the environmental lobbyists, she's going to tackle things like natural England, habitats regulations, judicial review, which is a huge blocker to many big industrial developments in Teesside at the moment, if she can move those things out of the way and get building, then that's absolutely fantastic. I just caution that I'm not sure whether this government has the appetite to have that type of fight with various different organisations and do what's needed to be done.
Hang on, the Tory party didn't even have the appetite to attempt that fight. At least this government, you've got to give them some credit for knowing the things that they're going to ask for, even if it runs into the sand later in the day.
Well, it's absolutely true that the Conservative Party and the Conservative government didn't do any of this either. I would push back and say things on, for example, nutrient neutrality and habitat regs, they did try and push back on, and actually it was the Labour Party that voted against those changes. But at the same time, people are fed up of the rhetoric. This is the point, and this government's falling foul of this if they're not careful. It's fine saying one thing, but you have to deliver and follow through. So absolutely, if she changes those regulations, if this government get rid of that red tape, tackle judicial review, they will have my complete support. I'm just not convinced that they're actually going to have the fight to do what they need to do.
This government's got a 163 majority. Of course they're going to get their way, aren't they?
I mean, I hope so. And like I say, if they do, then I'll back them for it. But I'm not convinced. There's a lot of politics in this. We've seen already large rebellions from the Labour Party on development. There was a private members' bill just last week that talked about protecting nature to the nth degree that would have absolutely stymied any development in this country. Now, that was a private members' bill, was never going to go through in the circumstances. But it shows that there is an undercurrent, that this isn't going to be plain sailing for the Labour government.
Now, listening closely to the thoughts of Lord Houchin there were, our guest this evening, the voice of big business, the former chief executive of BP, Lord Browne, the voice of small business, the executive director of the Small Businesses Federation, Craig Beaumont, plus the former director of communications for the Labour Party, Tom Baldwin, also biographer of Keir Starmer, and former Conservative advisor, Joe Tanner. It's great to have you all here. Lord Browne, to you first. What's your initial response to what we've heard from Rachel Reeves? We're starting to get a bit of a sense about what she's going to be laying out.
So we've heard, I think, a lot about enabling steps, clearing a few things up, getting very important, not to diminish them, but they're nonetheless enabling. I like one or two of the things, because in my field, I think if we can find any way of delivering lower electricity prices to people and in particular to industry as well in this country, it's far too high, it's in there.
What does that... I'm interested in your view on the energy strategy from Labour, because you get some people saying, look, this is great, this is loads of investment in energy, this is what we need, and other people saying, look, Miliband's got to get real, this is going to make prices go up. I don't know what you think.
Well, I think in our particular case, the way we make prices in this country has some issues we can sort out to get the prices down. The fact is that we have, renewables which are reasonably inexpensive. We have gas which is higher than the United States, but still stable. And I think we should therefore be quite competitive with some of the European countries. Very important to do. There are plenty of other things we need to do in energy. It's a very big business. It's the world's biggest business. And it should be the UK's biggest business, not just for domestic application, but also for export. We can invent things here very well. We just got to follow them through, and we need to focus our activity. And if no one thinks we can solve problems, just look at what happened in AI over the last 48 hours, where something out of left field changed everything. And we can do that with energy and the climate.
That's really interesting, actually. It does make you realise how things can just change and be shaken up so quickly like that. It does.
Yes.
What's your sort of take on how Rachel Reeves is doing? I mean, there's been some criticism, haven't there, of the budget and particularly the changes to national insurance.
Well, I mean, at the budget, you saw a Chancellor who would intervene to help small businesses. So on that national insurance rise, which we were very, very worried about, there was a carve-out for small employers from that, the employment allowance, 10,500 to every small business. So even when there's difficult decisions, this government can, if it wants to, intervene for small business. So when it comes to growth, it's like, OK, well, if you're a small business, what are the barriers that stop you from growing? Is it onerous planning requirements? Is it regulations? Is it infrastructure that just doesn't work around you? All those three things are true when you ask small businesses. So we're saying, OK, you're going to unblock infrastructure, you're going to allow Heathrow, potentially, it sounds rather nailed on now, to have its third runway after 23 years, I think it is, since it was first mooted. So time to move forward, positive energy, unlock growth, and hopefully with Heathrow you've got an increase in tourism, in exports, and suddenly you've got ways in which you can see small businesses really start to grow who are tapping into any of those sectors.
Yeah, that'd be the biggest tease ever, wouldn't it, if the Heathrow didn't actually go ahead after all this. It does feel, like you say, looks quite nailed on. And you were in number 11, weren't you? You met Rachel Reeves recently.
Indeed, we took some FSB members, brilliant ones, you know, a small exporter of food, a comms and PR agency from the EU, and it was all talking about, OK, what do we need? And they came out with things like, how do you give HMRC a growth duty? So it's not just the regulators you've spoken to, but how do you get a tax authority that's pro-growth, as well as obviously, collecting the taxes it needs to? And small businesses say HMRC is one of those biggest barriers. They can't get through to get to talk to someone, so you spend hours chasing and fighting to get seen or heard. And similarly on late payments, they're fighting to get paid. What if the FRC can now look at that and make sure that late payments, the package promised is delivered? That means that small business owners can then do what they're supposed to do, which is create jobs, generate growth, go out and expand into premises and employ more people.
Joe, I don't know what you think, but it feels to me like politicians have been talking about needing more growth. Well, I mean, like, you know, since the kind of doomsday or something. It's constant. Everyone wants growth. But politically, it's not that simple always, right?
No, and the challenge with growth, actually, is what is it?
Yeah.
Because growth means lots of different things to lots of different people. There's only tomorrow, the Good Growth Foundation, one of these new bodies set up, is actually looking at what does growth mean to individuals, and they're going to be talking about what that means for voters, because that's actually ultimately where the government are going to be judged. But I think the really welcome news from this is even just the acknowledgement that we need to talk up the UK more, because the government got the comms wrong. There's no question. While they were trying to set the narrative about what the Conservatives had clearly got wrong, they also then started to talk down the prospects for the UK. And I think that's where it's dangerous around investment, because there's lots of things you can do, but you have to enable businesses to do stuff. And I think that's what we're seeing. You know, you can hear from people in the sectors themselves, but actually just that narrative that if you're a firm that are thinking, are we going to open something new in the UK? Are we going to expand? You need a government that sounds like they're going to be pro making that happen. Whereas all the time it feels a bit gloomy. Why would you then say, well, if I'm going to put a pin in whichever country I'm going to go to, why would you pick the UK over others? And that is a big challenge for the government to make sure that happens.
Look, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, once you have the government fire up that engine for growth, it's beginning to create rattles elsewhere. I mean, you're beginning to really see it, you know, if they're going to do the Heathrow third runway, it'll create rattles with the environmental movement, which, you know, sees itself as a friend of this government. You're also going to see, I think, rattles in other parts of the government message. So, you know, this balancing out they've had in Europe. I think people are going to say, look, if you're prioritising growth above everything else, why aren't you doing closer links with Europe? That's a really big way. That's a really easy way to get growth. This act of self-harm we had with Brexit can begin to reverse some of that. You might see some rattles over immigration too. Yvette Cooper's now saying she wants these highly skilled immigrants to come in. In fact, you know, some people, you know, some of the tech, life sciences people who are very unhappy about living in America under Donald Trump are looking to come to the UK. Those are immigrants that we want to have. And so those are clean line messages that they have in the election, they may become a bit more blurred as they begin to speed through on growth.
Do you think they should... I'm interested about the kind of European point, because I'll be honest, whenever I do topics and conversations about the economy, everyone's like, no one's talking about Brexit, it's the elephant in the room. I mean, is that something that, you know, you think the government should be looking at again?
Well, clearly, Europe is a bigger hinterland of a market than the UK is, and of course the US is even bigger still. So, and that impels growth. You know, it sort of forces people to think, I've got a product, I've got a research product, I need to make a real product, I need to sell it. So you've got to work backwards and forwards. We're not very good at taking our research product. There's some brilliant people here in the UK. We should never let that go. And we have not made enough commercial sense of it. Now, we can't do it for everything. You can't let 1,000 flowers bloom and hope you get 1,000 great roses. It doesn't work like that. So you need to focus on the things you really are good at. focus on things that you can compete with. And while there's political change everywhere in the world, you need to look at that carefully and say, maybe I can exploit a loophole here, exploit a gap. People might want to come to this country, or they might decide to withdraw from a market, like little bits of the United States with climate-friendly technologies. So these are things which are gifts to the UK if we use them properly.
I can see you've got some thoughts on that as well.
For me, it's about yes and. I mean, I think you're right. EU was a massive issue before, and it was deliberately not an election issue because parties didn't want it to be one. But I think now the TCA was designed to improve. It was one of those fantastic agreements where you go, it can develop over time and you can add to it. We're seeing barriers in the way of exporting to the EU that now you might see. It might have to be quiet. It might not have to be quite so, up in bright lights, but there can be negotiations to improve things now that maybe we couldn't have done 6 months ago, and they've got the political cover to do it. And I think if you do start to do growth, and then there's a second decision that stops it, be that environmental, be that because of Brexit, because of if some of those fall away, suddenly you do start to get momentum. And I think they can do that without it being controversial. I think people can look at regulations that are working with the EU exporting, and they can now be adapted.
Just to go back to some of what you were saying about the kind of bumps, if you like, some of the nervousness some people may have on immigration or on Europe or on the environment. What do you think Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer should do about that? Do you think they should just be like, no, we've said growth is a priority, environment, yes, I hear your concerns, but you just got to suck it up? Or do you think that actually they do need to bring in the whole of the Labour movement with them?
Well, there's a balancing act to be done on the environment too. I mean, Ed Miliband, he wants to get his green infrastructure through. The way he's going to get that done quickly is by overcoming planning regulations and getting those decisions fast. So there's advantage if you're green in this happening. And I think explaining some of those trade-offs.
Although he throws quite hard when he's said before that he's against it. And...
Yeah, but I mean, there's lots of ways to go to economy. And one of the things that Rachel Reeves is going to announce tomorrow, I believe, is huge support for this Oxford-Cambridge corridor. She's doing a speech in Oxford. That could be worth £78 billion to this economy. So it is a sort of question of all systems go, and then how do you make other things fit to it? So I think the environment can fit to this. Because if we're going to hit those climate targets, and we're going to hit those clean energy targets, we're going to have to get green infrastructure built fast.
And they're going to have to upset some people. I think the bottom line is there will be folks that will not be happy in the same way that there were folks that weren't happy about winter fuel payments. No sooner did they start and they upset a whole chunk of their party that were not expecting a move like that. And I think that is part of the reality of governing. Elections can be won and you can say lots of stuff, but when you actually get in and you've got to do the job, it's a very different thing that you're faced with, and there will be trade-offs. I think Tom's right.
What do you think the Conservatives will do here? Because, I mean, some of this, I guess, would be music to their ears, right?
Well, I think it's a really interesting challenge because some of what they're doing is actually Richard Harrington, former business minister, wrote this report around investment, and it was a huge element around, there was sort of a big opportunity gap. I think he quoted about 50 billion in his report. And he's still working with the now government that have come in. And a lot of that was about backing winners. It was about, looking at planning. It was about providing a one-stop shop for government. That's stuff that the Tories were saying was the right thing to do. And Jonathan Reynolds came in and said, I agree, we need to do this. And he's still involved. And so, to some extent, the Tories have got a challenge here because as much as you might think, you want your opposition to fail, well, actually, it's not going to be good for anybody because no one will ever get a hospital appointment. No, there'll be queues outside of A&E if the public services do not manage to get back on their feet. So there is a really difficult political decision that they're going to have to face around where they're going to oppose and where they're going to be constructive.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about the government's contradictions and tensions. One of the reasons why the Tories couldn't grow the economy because they're anti-Europe, in a sort of almost religious way, they're anti all forms of immigration in a sort of myopic way, they're anti-house building, they're anti-green wind farms building. I mean, that's why you end up with a stunted economy. They're anti-investment. So there's a choice in the end. You can have a government which is really, really committed to this growth, and there's going to be problems for this government, and people complain this government doesn't have a clear shape. It's taking shape now. Not everyone will like it, but we're seeing the shape of it.
But imagine some of those Labour folks that have won the seats off the Tories, where the Tories were really opposing something locally, and then it's like, well, the government's saying we've got to do it. And those Labour folks are going to have a really difficult time.
The system's going to rattle, but at last you got a sense that they're driving for.
I'm not going to involve myself in the politics.
That's that half of the table.
But I do think it's very important in thinking through infrastructure, making sure that when the infrastructure is in a location, the people in the location get a benefit.
That's interesting.
It's really important. So if you've got a windmill, for example, I think it's much better when people know that that windmill is providing them with the electricity in their house. They're much more likely to feel better about it than if it's producing electricity for someone in London.
It's a very good point, actually.
It's one of the reforms that Ed Miliband's doing. He's really proud of it.
Localised. Got to localise, yeah.
I do want one little add-on, which is a message about get on with it. Because one thing about this government is it has until 2028, we're assuming, I mean, it could be 29, but 28 for the election. These projects take a long time. And I think there should be decisions as fast as they can so that you can start to get the procurement benefit fairly instantly, because you've got a decision and then the procurement, but you don't get the real benefits until later. Some of these big projects are so big that they won't be there when this government is in power. So it needs to get the procurement spent at least, and then start to show direction.
Hence why the planning stuff needs to happen, because otherwise they'll be locked in planning for years and the election will come and go.
It's been really great to talk to all of you. Our first discussion with 4 people in it. I think it's been really interesting, so thanks very much indeed. Now, Lord Peter Mandelson was spotted going to Downing Street earlier. There's, of course, been a lot of speculation over the last few weeks about whether or not he is definitely going to be approved as the UK ambassador to Washington. Well, tonight we understand that Donald Trump has agreed to him taking up the role. Let's go to Washington and our US correspondent, Mark Stone. Mark, you were reporting on this over the weekend. What's the latest?
Yeah, I mean, agrément is the word that is being used. It's my understanding that just before the inauguration, President Trump did agree. Agrément is the phrase that is used in diplomatic circles for Lord Mandelson to become Britain's ambassador here in Washington. But is that the end of the story? Well, we don't know yet, because there is a process that still needs to be followed. Lord Mandelson will now, I understand, imminently receive credentials from the King. He will then bring those credentials here to Washington, where he will first go to the State Department and present them from the King to the State Department, and then he will do it with the President here at the White House. So it is still theoretically possible, and given that President Trump is unpredictable, as we know, that he could, at the last minute, decide that he wants to reject it. But agrément is the word, and as we understand it right now, that particular part of the process, a crucial part of the process, has been given the green light from the White House. The reason it is controversial is because some within Trump circles are said to be uneasy about Mandelson. It wasn't all that long ago that Trump's campaign director called him a moron as a result of a podcast interview he'd done quite some time ago, in which he was critical of Donald Trump. Incidentally, Mandelson has clarified that criticism, saying he was speaking about what others think of Donald Trump. There is also some unease about Mandelson's ties to China. Over the years, he has been close to China, business dealings in China, it is said, and he had a previous friendship with Jeffrey Epstein. It's worth saying so did Trump. So all of that together has created a lot of noise about whether or not he is the right candidate. It is also the case, Sophie, that the Trump administration is very fond of Karen Pierce, the outgoing ambassador. They would like to have seen her stay on. It's not their choice, of course, and she's been here for quite some time. But agrément has now happened, as I understand it, and so one part of that process has now been cleared, and Lord Mandelson is expected to be here in Washington to take up his role, I think maybe next week, but certainly early in February. So that's that. The other thing, briefly to mention, a real spectacle here at the White House in the last hour, because that briefing room in there, the iconic briefing room, was fuller than I have ever seen it before for the incoming press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, the youngest ever press secretary ever to hold that role, giving her inaugural press briefing. And for me, Sophie, it was less about what she said and more about the tone. She was doing what we have seen other Trump officials and indeed Donald Trump do over the course of the past week, and demonstrate supreme confidence in their role, comfortable in their skin, a belief that they have a mandate from the American people to fundamentally change this country, change the way the federal system works, and of course, change diplomacy, as we've seen over the course of the weekend with those shots fired by Donald Trump, metaphorically, with Colombia backing down on migrants being sent back, and a big win there for Trump. So a really interesting press briefing, the first of many, I'm sure.
OK, thanks very much indeed, Mark Stone. There, we'll have more, of course, on that press briefing at the end of the programme. Now, back to the UK, because the Prime Minister has rejected the idea of setting a cap to cut migration levels, as new projections came out today showing the UK population is going to grow by nearly 5 million people over the next decade. Downing Street says the government will set out a comprehensive plan to tackle the issue instead. Well, the Office for National Statistics figures show the UK population could reach 72.5 million by mid-2032 because of net migration. Here's our data and forensics correspondent Tom Cheshire, who's been taking a closer look.
Births are declining, society is ageing, but the British population is growing, and it's growing a lot. And there's only one reason for that: immigration. The UK is on course to have the highest migration rate in Europe. From 2022 to 2032, the population is going to go up from 67.6 million to 72.5 million, according to projections. Not because of an increase in the birth rate. We will have 6.8 million births, but we'll also have 6.8 million deaths, so they cancel each other out. The increase is all from net migration, and it's 4.9 million people over the next 10 years. Now, this shows how that looks like from now until 2032. Migration coming down from its recent highs there, but still around 340,000 people per year, according to the Office for National Statistics. Still high compared to the historical record. Compare that to the recent past, though. Well, this is what happened from 2015 up to now. You can see it was fairly low here, and these big jumps over here. But we'll bring on another dotted line. Now, this shows what the projection was when experts were making those projections back in 2014. They thought it'd be pretty steady. You can see there were these big spikes they didn't account for. Their original projections way below what they're projecting now. Sometimes they've been way off in the past. Now, these all show a similar trend to United Nations projection by country. And based on this international comparison, we will have the highest migration rate in Europe, excluding countries with tiny populations where the rate can fluctuate a lot. At the same time, though, we are an ageing population too. The share of pension-age people in the UK in 2023, that was 18%. That'll go up 1% over the next 10 years by 2047. The end of this graph, it'll be 20%. What does that mean? Well, in November, the Office for Budget Responsibility suggested that total welfare spending on pensioners this year, 2024 to 2025, that'll be just over £150 billion. That is more than the day-to-day budgets of 3 government departments combined: the Home Office, Defence and Education. And pensioners will soon overtake the population share of children for the first time. So that means that the British population is growing, but it's also changing. And that is the top line, but it comes with a whole host of complicated questions for the economy and for society as a result.
Right, let's chat to Tom Baldwin and Joe Tanner again, shall we? It's a big number. I guess the question is, how do you manage it? I mean, what's your reaction to it, Joe?
It just shows the scale of the challenge that the government have got around how do you get public services that work? How do you get a system that actually can not only deal with the numbers, potentially look at how do you restrict numbers, how do you plan for industry, how do you plan for public services, but then how do you actually deliver the services that are needed for the sheer number of people that we're looking. And when you look at the changes in population from, elderly population and what they're going to need, we've been having endless debates about care and how are you going to look after an ageing population that have very complex needs. We've got youngsters with complex needs, and that number's growing all the time. So then you've got a lifetime of people with more complex needs and systems that are creaking.
Yeah, there's so many questions here. I mean, it feels to me like we could pull any strand of these figures, whether it is the birth rate, the ageing population, and talk about the consequences of it. There's been quite a lot of focus about Keir Starmer sort of rejecting the idea of a cap. And look, it's easy to say the Conservatives had a cap, it didn't work. But at the same time, is it not a useful measure, some would argue, to try and show a direction of travel on it?
I think it's an artificial measure because it doesn't tell you, just it's about numbers rather than who. Now, the Brexit referendum is supposed to be taking back control. Immigration was a big issue. Immigration went up subsequently. And what was happening is Boris Johnson let in lots of people in order to fill the gap of your Polish plumber and your French nurses, and they were bringing their dependents with them. And that wasn't necessarily the best way to get immigration. Now, we're just talking about growth. Immigration is good for growth. Immigration's been good for this country. It's been good for our public services. Now, you do want to be able to pick and choose. You do want to bring people in with skills. You do want to make sure that you're getting the people that you want in the public services or in the dynamic economy that you're trying to create. But at some point, we're going to have a more grown-up conversation about immigration, rather than just pretending it's a bad thing in all circumstances.
Do you think Keir Starmer needs to be a bit braver in the way he talks about immigration then?
Well, I think the numbers are going to come down. That's one thing for sure. You don't need to set targets, the numbers are coming down anyway. But I do think you need to make a case for the right kind of immigration, in the right kind of industries, in the right kind of public services. Because without that, you're not actually going to have those public services, you're not going to get economic growth. So it's one of these big arguments which they're going to have to face and win at some point, I think.
The birth rate is such a huge part of this discussion as well, isn't it? Because if we have a population that is skewing older, then that, as you were mentioning public services, that has a huge impact on it too. I mean, do you think that we need to do more to make it easier for people to start a family, whether that's housing, childcare?
Well, that's been one of the big questions, hasn't it? The big question has been, how do you support families? And how do you, I mean, even just the thinking behind, people that are wondering whether to start a family. We have people that can't live anywhere near their relatives because they can't afford to live near them or because the jobs are so far away. So actually that sort of cohesion around the family structure, which is a huge part of how many people growing up were sort of supported by grandparents or aunts that lived nearby or uncles that would sort of help out with childcare, for example. Whereas instead it's all become a debate about the expensive childcare. How do you support families that then have got those huge bills? Women that want to get back to work but then can't because by the time they do the sums, they're barely earning anything if they leave the house. And so I think there does need to be a lot more done about that. But I think it's really sad because we've got people that don't meet until much later in life as well. So then you've got women that say, I'm running out of time to have children. And then by then, it feels like an impossible decision because of the situation they're put in. So I think there does need to be more support for families. But also just, again, I think the public service challenge is huge. Public services and how effective they are affect lots of things that people choose. If they don't feel the schools are good enough locally, people are concerned. If they don't feel that they get good maternity care, for example, it will frighten people about whether they even want to have children. And also what will happen to those children as they grow up. Will they get the support that they need? So I do think it's a sort of multifaceted challenge, really, which we do have to face up to.
Yeah, it's. I mean, there's, like we were sort of saying, there's so many different parts of this conversation and debate, and a grown-up conversation, as you were saying, is almost what we
and when you
really
look at
need
huge
in all this
infrastructure,
stuff, right?
huge infrastructure projects, we end up needing to go and find labour from all over the place, don't you, to make things happen. A workforce doesn't just appear from nowhere.
And I think we've got to come. Sometimes I think the way this is reported. When people think of immigration, they think of desperate asylum seekers coming across in rubber dinghies. That's a fraction of the immigration. In fact, we have quite low numbers of asylum seekers compared to the rest of Europe. The real issue of immigration is people coming in legally, and we need to have a big grown-up conversation about what kind of immigration we need, because we do need to have immigrants in this country if we're going to grow the economy, if we're going to make our NHS work. Enoch Powell, I suppose the sort of kingpin of anti-immigration language, when he was briefly a Minister for Health, he went out and recruited tens of thousands of people from the Caribbean to work in the NHS because they were needed and they are heroes of the NHS.
OK, thank you both very much indeed. Really interesting discussion there. Well, of course, those net migration figures for your short feature in tomorrow's newspapers. We'll have our extended press preview from 10:30 this evening with tonight's news and tomorrow's headlines. Joining us will be the Associate Editor of the Daily Mirror, Kevin Maguire, and the Deputy Comment Editor at The Telegraph, Annabelle Denham. Coming up next on the Politics Hub. Donald Trump's new press secretary, gun-toting MAGA loyalist Caroline Leavitt, has given her first press briefing, making history as the youngest person ever to take up the role. Can she win over the grizzled ranks of Washington's press corps? But up next, the former Defence Secretary Grant Shapps tells me we need to get serious about growth, and that means Heathrow needs a third runway. Hello, welcome back. The Chinese company DeepSeek wiped $1 trillion off the US stock market with the launch of its AI software this week. Now, DeepSeek challenges the US firm ChatGPT on performance, but because it uses far fewer chips, it operates at a fraction of the cost. Now, speaking to House Republicans on Monday, President Trump called the development a wake-up call for our industries that we need to be laser-focused on competing to win. So with AI the latest front in a geopolitical power struggle between East and West, and on the eve of Rachel Reeves' growth speech tomorrow, I spoke to the former Defence Secretary, the Cabinet Minister, Shapps. Great to have you on the programme. Thanks for coming on.
Pleasure.
Before we talk about the report that I saw you've got, I just want to ask your opinion on Heathrow, because we're obviously expecting the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, to make a push for another runway. What's your view?
Absolutely right. It's crazy it's taken all these years. I know COVID and other things intervened. But like, if we're serious as a country, if we want to grow, actually grow the economy, but also kind of just even keep pace in the world, you've got to build infrastructure. I always thought it was a crazy plan all those years ago to fudge it and not build it. And there was the Howard Davis report and it pushed it elsewhere to all the different... Like, you, in a major capital city, you've got to have proper facilities, and airport is one of very many things we need.
Were you, just listening to how you clearly feel quite strongly about this, were you sort of frustrated by NIMBYs on your own side?
I don't think it's even NIMBYs, actually. I think we actually just fundamentally as a country need to get serious if we're going to build stuff, right? And some things are just in the national interest, and that means that on occasion you have to go, this is what Parliament's for. It's able to pass legislation that says, in the national interest, we'll do X or Y. And, all those years of prevarication,
Under you guys, right? Yeah.
Well, I'm not making it I don't need to make it as a political point. I'm not making it as a political point. I just think it is crazy that you have other European capitals with 3, 4, 5 runways and Heathrow coping just about on 2. It's holding Britain back, and it's time to change it.
Now, you have co-authored a report on security, and it does feel like the world's at a very, I guess, kind of precarious point. Yeah. What are you concluding?
So this is a report from the Coalition for Global Prosperity. They've done a great job on it, as you say. I've written the forward for it. It actually plays off a speech I made exactly a year ago at Lancaster House as Defence Secretary, where I sort of said the world's gone from being in a post-war, post-Second World War era to a pre-war era. Not because I think we're about to immediately go to war, but if we don't watch it, if we don't get serious about defence and making sure that the world remains stable, we'll live to regret it. This report does a great job of really a year on reflecting on what's happened, and I think that everyone from NATO to a lot of world leaders agree with the sentiment I was expressing that day now, a year later. And in particular, they make the point that if you are going to make a more stable world, Britain needs to be active in the world. So things like the development budgets and the way we use those things, hugely important to making sure that problems don't just frankly come home to roost.
You talk about the development budget, but there's obviously a lot of focus on the defence budget as well. Donald Trump has recently said that NATO countries should be spending 5% of their GDP on defence. I mean, is that anywhere near realistic?
Well, look, first of all, we didn't actually spend 5% during the Cold War. I think I was looking in 1984, I think it peaked at about 4.7 off the top of my head. But I do agree with him. We should be spending a lot more. I fought tooth and nail, and bluntly, between you and me, I can say this now, I won a battle within government and convinced the Prime Minister and the Chancellor.
It's not just between me and you, right? Like,
oh,
this is not how
no
TV
one told
works,
me.
So.
But it was a difficult battle, and to put our defence spending up to 2.5%, which means that you immediately release new money to spend, and to do that by the end of this decade. This government came in, said, yeah, no, we want to get to 2.5%, but no timetable. And we hear now it's going to be delayed by at least another couple of years. And that is dangerous. It's dangerous for us. And I'll tell you this, it will cost us more in the long run if we don't tell our adversaries now that we're going to be prepared, because they'll take advantage of us. And, it will cost us more than it would have cost just to put that defence in place.
I guess what Labour would say is that, yes, the Conservatives, the last government, set out a roadmap to getting to that target on defence spending, but it was a fantasy roadmap. It was the kind of roadmap that, if you looked at spending in other departments, that if you were ever going to win the election, you wouldn't have been able to stick to.
Well, they're talking complete and utter nonsense. And I say this as someone who's just said, I think they're doing the right thing if it's to be believed on Heathrow. So I don't make this as a political point. I make it because it's a reality. To govern is to choose. We chose that defence was the thing. Defence of the realm was the most important thing that we needed to be doing. It was funded. It would have added billions, tens of billions more into our defence budget. I can tell you right now that there are cuts going on in the MOD that are putting this country at risk, and this government is culpable of allowing that to happen.
Can I ask you about AI? Because it feels like this is another, I guess, part of the geopolitical struggle between the US and China. We've obviously seen DeepSeek throwing the markets into turmoil. Do you think we need to be careful here?
Well, first of all, I think AI is going to absolutely fundamentally change everything. And right now, people walk around and are not clear that this is the case, but it is going to be totally life-changing. Think of the internet all over again, times 10. That is what we're going to experience. It's going to be huge. Secondly, I see the markets yesterday in particular were very, very troubled by the idea that somebody, the Chinese in this case, had come out with a language model which was much cheaper to train. This is the issue. And therefore, do they need to be investing all this money in the infrastructure? My answer to that is actually, we've always known it's going to come down in price. That trend is perfectly obvious in 10 years' time. If you want to submit a query in ChatGPT or anything else, it's going to be much cheaper. So that was always going to be the case. I think the market sort of, as often these things, overreact. I saw it's correcting a bit back again today, because the reality is, if it's cheaper to use AI, it will be used in more stuff, more queries will be made on it, and therefore the amount of capacity you required will still go up much faster. So, my analysis of this is really not as much to see here as was originally thought. I think more worrying, if you type into the new Chinese DeepSeek, what happened in Tiananmen Square when protesters were crushed, it has nothing to say on it. And I think that is more concerning than the cost of this tech, which of course will come down, and that's a good thing.
So AI becomes political in that sense?
Well, this is not new at all. We know that the communists don't believe in having political competition.
Interview there with Grant Shapps. Still to come on the Politics Hub. Donald Trump's new press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, has given her debut White House briefing at 27 years old. She's the youngest person to hold the job, and it is a tough gig. Can she outlast her predecessors?
Coming up on the UK Tonight at 8 o'clock, one family's campaign to make it a crime not to call 999 after a death or medical emergency. Tonight, we'll bring you Kimberly's story. Plus, how would you feel if your bins were only collected once every 4 weeks? We'll hear about the council considering doing just that. And we'll talk about homophobia in sport after former Premier League referee David Coote says he didn't tell the public he was gay because of abuse from fans. All that, much more, on the UK Tonight at 8.
I'm Stuart Ramsey, and I'm Sky's chief correspondent. Free wherever you get your news.
I'm Mark Stone, and I'm Sky's correspondent based here in Washington, D.C. Sky News, get the full story first.
I'm Katie Spencer, and I'm Sky News' arts and entertainment correspondent.
I'm Lisa Dowd, and I'm one of Sky's Midlands correspondents. The reason I do this job is because you never know where it's going to lead.
Migrants risk their lives climbing aboard these trains in search of a dream, the United States.
It's really dangerous. They often get robbed on this train.
They suffer a lot by police, cartels.
What happens to them next, we just don't know. Do you miss your mum?
Yeah. With Trump coming to the presidency, how much longer will people be accommodated?
The journey you've been through, it's been very difficult at times. Has it been worth it?
See. This is a journey which goes by one name, the Beast.
Our app gives you the very best of Sky News wherever you are. Breaking news, videos and analysis.
Evidence of the crisis.
Podcasts, watching us live.
Live here from Washington.
Wherever you get your podcast.
All in one place. And all at just the touch of a screen. The Sky News app. Get the full story first.
A lot of action going on. I'm Alex Crawford and I'm Sky's special correspondent based in Istanbul.
This is what makes the job so fantastic.
Sunday, exclusively on Peacock, with the top of the Premier League still unsettled.
This duo have been in a league of their own.
Two clubs desperately scramble to climb the table.
The blockbuster fixture.
Arsenal.
Just what Arsenal needed.
Manchester City.
Chance for Haaland. Goal for Haaland.
This is the Premier League. Sunday, 11:30 Eastern, only on Peacock.
Hello, welcome back. Well, it is a new term in office for Mr. Trump, and with that, he's got a new spokesperson to deal with the small matter of the media. And Caroline Leavitt, the youngest White House press secretary in history, made her debut at the White House press briefing podium today. It's a pretty confident performance. Let's have a listen.
We're also opening up this briefing room to new media voices who produce news-related content and whose outlet is not already represented by one of the seats in this room. We welcome independent journalists, podcasters, social media influencers, and content creators to apply for credentials to cover this White House.
And she follows in the footsteps of some pretty recognisable figures, because Donald Trump went through a fair few press secretaries in his first term. First up was Sean Spicer. Remember him? Well, he spent just 6 months and a day in the role, became a favourite impersonation on the US TV show Saturday Night Live. He was also famous for once spending several minutes huddled behind a bush to avoid the press. Now, next up was Sarah Huckabee Sanders, who took over from Mr. Spicer. She was seen as a bit of a steadying hand. She didn't exactly relish talking to the press, though, because she hosted fewer press conferences than any of the 13 previous White House press secretaries. You might have thought that was a bit of a prerequisite for the job, but there you go. Now, Donald Trump's next press secretary, Stephanie Grisham, held even fewer. She hosted a grand sum of 0 daily press briefings, so that one went particularly well. And the final press secretary of Donald Trump's first term was Kayleigh McEnany. After her stint, she appeared regularly on Fox News as a Republican commentator. Right, let's bring in Tom and Joe, shall we? I feel like it's all part of the kind of televised presidency of Donald Trump. He's a man who gets TV, right? And this is such an important role for him as well. What do you make of it all?
Yeah, I mean, this is a big American tradition. I mean, we tried it briefly. Well, we were going to try it briefly in this country with Boris Johnson, and it didn't really work out for Allegra Stratton, unfortunately. So, I mean, maybe this is an American tradition. There's also, it seems to be a tradition of press spokespeople have names like what they do. So you had, Ronald Reagan had Larry Speaks, which was a perfect name for a spokesperson, and Sean Spicer, produced a certain sort of flavour at least. And I was very excited because this one, her name is spelt at least, Leave It. So, as you say, they don't last very long, so I wondered how long it was going to be before they leave it, but apparently it's pronounced Levitt, so it's in fact not really a joke at all.
Oh, that was good. It was a good effort,
though. Well, it's almost a joke. It's almost a joke.
No, I love a bad joke. I've got a bit of a soft spot for them, so, we're very, very welcome for all kinds of jokes, good or bad, on the Politics Hub. It's absolutely fine. It hasn't taken off over here, has it? The kind of idea of this kind of televised press spokesperson, right?
No, I mean, if anything, we have a complete opposite, don't we? Because we have the fact that cameras aren't there and you get this sort of report of what was said by a spokesperson. And we even now have a situation where the government don't always put people up. I mean, the opposition aren't exactly always putting people up on broadcasts anyway to answer questions directly. But there is a real, this woman is, I mean, it's everyone's focusing on her age, but it's a hell of a job.
Yeah,
and
true.
It is a big vote of confidence in her. We know, obviously, that he can get through spokespeople, so it doesn't necessarily mean she'll last the term. But I think it is going to be fascinating because she's very bolshy. She clearly feels that she's got the confidence of the president behind her. So she's, potentially going to be trying to make mincemeat of the journalists that are in that press room. And they've already talked about changing the flavour of who's in there because they're bringing other outlets in.
Yeah.
But she's also, let's face it, I mean, we know what that job entails and the way journalists work. But you've also got a member of the government who's putting everything on X overnight, which is going to make that job incredibly challenging.
And then you become the face of the policy, right? Because you're the one on TV giving the defence, announcing it. It is, high stakes indeed.
But it's going to be great. It's going to be the best ever press secretary, right?
So yeah, absolutely. There we go. Thanks both very much indeed. Great to have you on the show tonight. Well, that is it from us this evening. I'll see you tomorrow at 7. Up next, it is UK Tonight with Sarah Jane Mee. But I'll see you tomorrow, of course, for that big announcement from Rachel Reeves. See you then.